Someone says something nice to you, something genuine, something they actually mean. And you do the thing, you look away, or you laugh a little too quickly, or you say, oh, it was nothing, honestly, anyone could have done it. And you watch the moment dissolve, and somewhere underneath the deflection, there is a person who is absolutely furious at themselves for doing it again. You knew it was coming, you could feel the compliment arriving like weather, and you still couldn't just receive it. That's not a quirk, that's not modesty, that is a system, and it has been running in you for a long time. There's something almost painful about watching it happen in real time in yourself or in someone you love. Someone tells them they did something beautifully, and you can see the exact moment they decide not to believe it, not consciously. They're not sitting there choosing disbelief like a menu option. It happens faster than that. The compliment lands and something in them immediately begins to work against it, quietly, efficiently, like an immune system rejecting a transplant. The words don't fit the shape of what they think they are, so the words get returned to sender. What's living underneath that? What is the actual mechanism that makes a kind sentence feel like something you need to get away from? Because this matters not just for how you feel in small social moments, but for what it does over the years, to your relationships, to your ability to let people in, to whether the people who love you ever feel like you actually believe them. There is a version of this pattern that quietly teaches everyone around you that their affection doesn't land. That loving you is a little like sending letters to an address where no one checks the mail. And there are several very different reasons a person ends up here, some loud, some barely visible, some that will sound so familiar you'll feel exposed just listening. The concept you need to understand first isn't self-esteem exactly. It's something that sits underneath self-esteem, something older and more structural. Think about what happens when you hold a belief about yourself for long enough. Any belief, it doesn't matter if it's accurate. What matters is that it becomes load-bearing. It starts to organize everything, how you interpret what people say about you, what you remember, what you dismiss. Psychologists call this a self-schema. A cognitive framework you've built, usually without realizing it, that acts as a filter between you and incoming information. When new information arrives that fits the schema, you absorb it easily. When new information arrives that contradicts it, when someone tells you that you're talented or beautiful or that they're genuinely lucky to have you, your brain doesn't just accept it. It processes it as a threat to the internal architecture, not because you're broken, because consistency feels safe, because the self you've constructed, even if it's a painful self, is at least a self you know how to navigate. A compliment, when it contradicts the schema, doesn't feel like a gift. It feels like interference. And the deflection, the laugh, the dismissal, the redirect is the system restoring order. This is what researchers in social cognition call self-verification theory. We actively seek confirmation of our existing self-concept, even when that concept is negative, even when it hurts us. Because the unknown is scarier than the painful. Picture this. Someone turns in a project, something they worked on for weeks, maybe months, something that required real pieces of them. And their manager pulls them aside and says, genuinely, this is exceptional work. Seriously, you should be proud. And they smile, they nod, they say thank you, and on the inside, the first thought is not gratitude. The first thought is, he hasn't seen all of it yet. Once he reads the third section, he'll realize. Or, she's just being kind because she knows I've been struggling. Or even, if this is exceptional, the bar must be lower than I thought. The compliment arrives and they immediately begin auditing it. looking for the catch, searching for the error in the other person's judgment that would explain why they said something so implausible. This is the auditor. And the auditor is not cynical, not arrogant, not broken. The auditor is exhausted. The auditor has spent years bracing for the moment when the gap between what people think of them and what they know themselves to be gets discovered. The compliment doesn't feel like safety. It feels like the gap is widening. It feels like more weight on a structure they're already straining to hold up. The wound underneath the auditor is not that I am not good enough. It is, I am good enough at pretending to be good enough, and eventually someone will notice the difference. The performing, the achieving, the working harder than anyone, none of it was ever really about ambition. It was about staying ahead of exposure. And when someone calls the performance excellent, the auditor hears the mask is working, which means the mask still has to stay on. Does that land somewhere? Then there is a quieter version of this. Someone says something kind, not about performance, but about character. You are one of the most thoughtful people I've ever met. And the person receiving it doesn't audit the compliment. They just can't hold it. They set it down almost immediately, the way you'd set down something fragile that you don't trust yourself with. They change the subject. They deflect to the other person. You're so much more thoughtful than I, honestly. They are not rejecting the compliment out of suspicion. They are rejecting it because receiving it would require believing it. And believing it would require a recalibration of a self-concept that has, for a very long time, been organized around unworthiness. This is different from the auditor. The auditor believes the performance is real, they just fear it's not enough. This person, call them the deflector, doesn't fully believe the performance or the character. The praise doesn't trigger an alarm at being caught. It triggers something closer to grief, because there is a part of them that wants to believe it. That is desperate to believe it. And the wanting is so loaded, so risky, that it is safer, genuinely, functionally safer, to send the compliment back before they can let themselves feel it. What's underneath the deflector is almost always a story they were handed early. A story about what they deserved and what they didn't, about whether people like them got to take up that kind of space. The deflection is not false modesty. It is a very old, very loyal attempt to protect themselves from the specific pain of reaching for something and having it disappear. But here is where it gets more complicated. Because not everyone who struggles with compliments looks like they're struggling. Some of them look like they're gracious, or busy, or appropriately humble. There's a third pattern, one that is, in some ways, the hardest to identify because it wears the cleanest surface. Someone receives a compliment and they handle it beautifully. They say thank you, they hold eye contact, they even smile in a way that looks genuine, and they feel absolutely nothing. The compliment passes through them like light through glass. It registers as data, someone said something positive, but it doesn't touch anything. This person has not defended against the compliment. They've built something more sophisticated than a defense. They've built distance. They have learned, somewhere along the way, that allowing another person's positive perception of them to matter is a liability. Because what happens when that perception changes? What happens when the person who called you brilliant leaves, or turns cold, or finds out something about you they didn't know before? If you never really let the warmth in, you never have to survive its withdrawal. This is the glass wall, and it is lonelier than it looks. Because from the outside, they seem fine. From the inside, they are watching human warmth move toward them and feeling the strange, specific grief of not being able to let it arrive. The wound underneath the glass wall isn't self-doubt. It's the decision, usually made in the aftermath of something painful, that needing people's good opinion is a weakness they can no longer afford. And then there is the fourth pattern. The one that doesn't deflect, doesn't audit, doesn't go cold, it panics. Someone says something wonderful about you, and you feel absurdly like you might cry, not because you're moved, because you are overwhelmed. Because the kindness is so at odds with what you've been carrying, your nervous system doesn't know how to root it. You make a joke. You turn it into something light. You get louder or quieter, or you leave the room earlier than you planned. This is the person who grew up in an environment where warmth was unpredictable, where kindness sometimes came with conditions or reversals or costs you didn't see coming. Compliments in that environment weren't just compliments. They were weather systems. They preceded something, so the body learned to brace. And now, even in safe environments, even from people who mean every word, when something genuinely good is said about you, the old system activates. Not because you think something bad is coming, but because the body doesn't know the difference yet between then and now. The panic isn't about the compliment. It's about the history embedded in the nervous system that the compliments used to sit in. What all four of these have in common, the auditor, the deflector, the glass wall, and the panic, is that they have been treated, usually by the people carrying them, as character flaws, as proof of something broken, as evidence that they are too damaged, too difficult, too something to just be normal about a kind sentence. And here is the reframe, not as a fix, not as a resolution, just as a different way to look at it. Every one of these patterns was, at some point, intelligent. The auditor's vigilance kept them performing at a level that earned them safety. The deflector's modesty protected them from the specific pain of believing something they would later have to stop believing. The glass wall kept someone functioning after a loss that intimacy made possible. The panic was a body doing exactly what it learned to do. These aren't malfunctions. These are solutions that worked somewhere for something at a time when you needed them to. The question isn't why am I like this? The question, and it's a harder one, is are the conditions that required this solution still present? Because sometimes they are. And sometimes you have moved somewhere safer than the place where the system was built. And the system hasn't been told. You already know which one of these you recognized, not the one you wanted to recognize, the one you actually did. And maybe you've always thought of it as proof of something wrong with you. This strange inability to just take a compliment. This thing that makes people love you a little harder because you won't let them. Consider the possibility that it isn't a flaw in your character. Consider that it might be the most loyal thing in you, still protecting you, still working, still doing the exact job it was built to do. The only question left is whether you still need the protection, or whether some part of you might be ready, slowly, to let something in.